Hello, ancient philosophers. Welcome to our second of 3 units on Hellenistic and Roman philosophy, this time on Cynicism, Skepticism, and the Hellenistic philosophy of religion. We'll here again be using Pierre Hadot's chapter on the Hellenistic school, as well as selections from Diogenes Laertius on Diogenes the Cynic and on the life of Pyrrho, and some arguments from Sextus Empiricus's outlines of Pyrrhonism and against the professors, before turning finally to a vivid example of debate between the 3 major schools, Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Skepticism, and Cicero's dialogue on the nature of the gods. So let's start with Cynicism. We did cover Diogenes of Sinope, or Diogenes the Cynic, a fair bit when we were looking at Cogent Caratani's interpretation of Socrates in our 2 weeks on Socrates. Cynicism was in fact an influential movement in the origins of Stoicism. It was only a philosophical school in the loosest sense, sometimes said to be founded by Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, although this is still debated. The Cynics called themselves the Cynosarges, or the Silver Dog, and they seem to be most remembered for rebelling against the rigidity of Plato and Aristotle and admiring Socrates' disdain for fashion and practice of intellectual questioning, especially the image of Socrates as a gadfly sent to goad the Athenians to virtue. They believed that the very essence of civilization is corrupt, and so lived austere, unconventional lives, often as hobos it seems. They distrusted most all luxury and social convention as a hook that always brought complications and frustrations into life. But happiness is attainable only comes through self-discipline and rational control of all the desires and appetites, with minimal contact with corrupting influences in the social order. According to Hadot, the Cynics for their part did not argue and gave no instruction. It was their very life that bore meaning within itself and implied an entire doctrine. And in this sense, Cynicism was a popular missionary philosophy, with ardent propagandists since Diogenes who addressed themselves to all social classes. Preaching by example, they denounced social convention and urged a return to simple life in conformity with nature. Stoics, you will recall, also taught conformity with nature, but what exactly that means for the Cynics and also the Skeptics is a bit different, as we'll see this week. There is still no consensus as to whether Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates, was the founder of the movement, but it is agreed that his disciple Diogenes was a leading figure. Cynicism never took up an institutional character like the other schools, but remained alive until the end of antiquity. The Cynic way of life was spectacularly opposed not only to the life of non-philosophers, but even to the lives of other philosophers. The Aristotelians were devoted to scientific research, the Epicureans to a simple, retired life, and the Stoics to adaptation to the way of nature, even when that took the form of politics. But the Cynics alone radically broke with the world. They rejected what most people considered the elementary rules and indispensable conditions for life, such as cleanliness, pleasant appearance, and even courtesy. They were absolutely unconcerned with social proprieties and opinions, despised money, but did not hesitate to beg, and avoided seeking any stable position within the city. They were without a city, without a home, without a country, miserable, wandering, living from day to day. In short, they were the original philosophical hobos, their bags containing only what was strictly necessary for survival, and they did not fear the powerful, but rather always expressed themselves with provocative freedom of speech, or parrhesia. Hadot notes that Cynicism is a kind of limit case for ancient philosophy. They gave no scholarly instruction, but may have contributed to literary activity like the writing of poetry. This may be debatable, as many texts are attributed to Diogenes of Sinope, but none have survived. But despite having no formal institutions, they did form a school with strict relationships of master and disciple. Cynicism is the only major philosophy in the ancient world in which philosophical discourse seems reduced to a minimum. For example, when someone declared that motion didn't exist, Diogenes simply got up and began to walk. For Hadot, Cynicism was, in essence, the choice of freedom as complete independence. In Greek, autarkia. That is, independence from the useless needs and a refusal of luxury and vanity. They clearly had a justification for this choice of life, but it has not survived in any theoretical treatises. There are many typically cynical philosophical concepts, but what survives are only anecdotes, which display them as concrete attitudes tied up with that choice of life. Concepts such as ascesis, ataraxia, autarkia, effort, adaptation to circumstances, impassiveness, simplicity, and the absence of vanity, as well as a lack of modesty. The most basic commitment of the Cynic seems to be that of choosing a way of life which most corresponds to the state of nature, or phusis, and thus resembles animals or children, and is as far as possible from the conventions of civilization, or nomos. For example, Diogenes threw away his bowl and cup when he saw children do without such utensils, and he drew comfort regarding his way of life when he saw a mouse eat a few crumbs in the dark. In the extensive discussions of nature versus culture which we first find in the Sophists, the Cynics radically choose nature and pursue its simplicity with diligent exercise, ascetics, and with effort. For them, the artifices, conventions, and commodities of civilization, luxury, and vanity soften the body and mind. And so the Cynic way of life can be considered as an almost athletic yet reasoned training to endure hunger, thirst, foul weather, so that the individual might acquire freedom, independence, inner strength, relief from worry, and a peace of mind which would be able to adapt itself to all circumstances. At this point, they sound a lot like the wandering sadhus of India. Famously, Plato is supposed to have said of Diogenes that he was a Socrates gone mad. Hadot notes that whether or not this is true, it gives us cause for reflection, for in a way, Socrates was the precursor of the Cynics. And the comic poets also mocked Socrates' external appearance, his bare feet and old cloak. Furthermore, the figure of Socrates is conflated in the Symposium of Plato with that of Eros as a beggar. And according to this comparison, wasn't Diogenes a homeless wanderer with a poor traveling bag, a kind of second Socrates, a heroic figure of the unclassifiable philosopher, and a stranger to the world? Indeed, like Socrates, Diogenes thought he had been entrusted with the mission of making people reflect, of denouncing their vices and errors with caustic attacks on their way of life. Nevertheless, his care for himself was indissolubly also a care for others. Both the Socratic and the cynical care of the self or the soul helps people to attain inner freedom and dissolve the illusions of appearances and phantoms linked to social convention, nomos. It seems that the Cynics lack entirely Socrates' smiling urbanity, their pursuit of the way of nature being in some ways a more tortured pastoralism, in others a distorted mirror reflected back to the ways of the polis. I'm going to read to you now, with only some commentary, various passages from Diogenes Laertius' Life of Diogenes. He was a native of Sinope and son of a banker. He went into exile because his father committed fraud, adulterated the coinage. Some say it was Diogenes, and he confesses as much in much testimonia, even claiming that it was the oracle at Delphi who told him to do it. This in fact suggests a loose line to Socrates as well, since, as you might recall, Socrates is set on his own philosophic mission by Apollo's oracle. In this case, however, Apollo advises Diogenes to a life of crime, which, eventually giving up, is the very thing causes him to come to Athens and to fall in with Antisthenes. So in a way, Apollo's advice is a roundabout path through crime to philosophy. This is actually not an uncommon biographical itinerary for the philosopher. The recently passed Bernard Stiegler was a French jewel thief before becoming one of the most major French philosophers after Derrida. At first, when Diogenes, in exile for his crimes, came to Athens, Antisthenes was repulsed by him, for he never welcomed pupils, but by sheer persistence Diogenes wore him out. The story is related that once Antisthenes held out his staff as if to strike Diogenes, and the pupil offered his head with the words, "Strike, for you will find no wood hard enough to keep me away from you, so long as I think you've something to say." And from that time forward, he was his pupil, and exile as he was, set about a simple way of life. Diogenes' way of life is first broached in terms again of the tale of imitating the mouse, who scurries about without a resting place, not afraid of the dark, not seeking any of the things that are considered dainties, again relishes, opson. Diogenes as mouse discovers the means of adapting himself to circumstances. He was the first to sleep in his cloak, yet folded as a matter of principle, so he was basically the first committed hobo. The portico of Zeus, or hall of the processions, he considered Athens' gift to him, a place to stay. Later, he famously lived in a tub or barrel, and he liked to roll in it over hot sand in summer, and in winter to embrace statues covered in snow, all this as a means of inuring himself to hardship. Diogenes was also great at pouring scorn on his contemporaries. The school of Euclides was called bilious, and Plato's lectures a waste of time. The theatrical performances at the Dionysia, great peep shows for fools, and demagogues whipping up a crowd were the mob's lackeys. He doesn't seem to have completely disrespected everyone, for he also says that when he sees physicians, philosophers, and ship's pilots at their work, he deems man the most intelligent of all animals. But again, when he saw interpreters of dreams and diviners, and those who attended to them, or those who puffed themselves up with the conceit of wealth, he thought no animal more silly or stupid. He would continually say that for the right conduct of life, we need either reason or yoke. There are many anecdotes regarding his interactions with Plato. Cross Laertes' account, but I brought them all here together. Observing Plato one day at a costly banquet taking olives, he said, "How is it that you, the philosopher who sailed to Sicily for the sake of these dishes, now when they are before you do not enjoy them?" Referring, of course, to Plato's failed attempt to convert the tyrant of Syracuse to philosophy. "Nay, by the gods, Diogenes," replied Plato, "there also, for the most part, I lived upon olives and such like." "Why then," said Diogenes, "did you need to go to Syracuse? Is it that Attica at that time did not grow olives?" This interaction might be misattributed, but we find a similar one elsewhere. Another time when he was eating dried figs when he encountered Plato and offered him a share of them. When Plato took them and ate them, Diogenes quipped, "I said you might share them, not that you might eat them all up." And there are yet more potentially spurious anecdotes of interactions of Diogenes and Plato, such as Diogenes once asked Plato for wine, and after that also for some dried figs. Plato sent him a whole jar, and then Diogenes says, "If someone asks you how many 2 and 2 are, will you answer 20? So it seems you neither give as you are asked, nor answer as you are questioned." Thus he scoffed at Plato as one who talked without end. And also, Plato saw him washing lettuce and came up to him and quietly said, "Had you paid court to Dionysius, you wouldn't now be washing lettuce." And that he, with equal calmness, made answer, "If you had washed lettuce, you would not have paid court to Dionysius." If there is any truth to these anecdotes, it seems the relation of these two philosophers was playfully contrarian, involving a back and forth of witty quips, usually but not always regarding food. On another occasion, Plato had invited to his house friends coming from Dionysius. Diogenes trampled upon his carpets and said, "I trample upon Plato's vainglory." Plato's reply was, "How much pride you expose to view, Diogenes, by seeming not to be proud." In another account, Diogenes' words were, "I trample upon the pride of Plato," who retorted, "Yes, Diogenes, with pride of another sort." One of the most famous food jokes between them, Plato had defined a man as an animal, biped, and featherless, and was applauded. Diogenes plucked a fowl and brought it into the lecture room with the words, "Here is Plato's man." In consequence, it was added to the definition of man, also having broad nails. In another wicked burn, Plato was conversing about ideas and using the nouns tablehood and cuphood. Diogenes retorted, "Table and cup I see, but your tablehood and cuphood, Plato, I can nowise see." "That's readily accounted for," said Plato. "You have the eyes to see the visible table and cup, but not the understanding by which ideal tablehood and cuphood are discerned." At the very least, I'm inclined to grant some humorous interactions occurred between the two philosophers, that Plato's judgment of Diogenes as a Socrates gone mad is genuine. Diogenes seemed to have considered the men of Athenian Athens as soft and good for nothing. Being asked one day where in Greece he found good men, he replied, "Good men nowhere, but good boys at Sparta." As to the character of Diogenes' teaching, we hear that when one day he was gravely discoursing and nobody attended him, he began to whistle, and as people clustered about him, he reproached them with coming in all seriousness to hear nonsense, but only slowly and contemptuously when the testimony was serious. He also excoriated excessive competition, for men strive in digging and kicking to outdo one another, but few strive to become good men and true. He also railed against the ills of overspecialization, such as when grammarians investigate the ills of Odysseus while they are ignorant of their own, when musicians tune the strings of a lyre but leave the disposition of their souls discordant, when mathematicians gaze and calculate the sun and the moon but overlook matters close at hand, or when orators make a fuss about justice in their speeches but never practice it. He seems to have been great at calling out hypocrisy, and it appears that much of his teaching consisted precisely in this. For example, instead of praising humble, honest men like the rest, called them out for envying the rich, and was moved to anger that men should sacrifice to the gods to ensure health, but in the midst of the very sacrifice, feast to the detriment of their health. Again, against most social conventions, he would praise those who were about to marry but refrained, and those who intended to go on a voyage but never set sail. For those who thought about a career in politics but never pursued it, or those who intended to have a family but decided not to. Here Diogenes sounds like the original Bartleby in Herman Melville, with his praise of the "I would prefer not to." Unlike Plato, who was almost sold into slavery when things went south in Syracuse, Diogenes was actually sold as a slave. When he was put up for sale and asked what he could do, he replied, "Govern men." He told the auctioneer to advertise him as a master. Thinking that this would make his own sale more difficult, "It makes no difference," said he, "for in whatever position fishes lie, they still find purchasers." To Xeniades, who purchased him, he said, "You must obey me, although I am a slave, for if a physician or a steersman were in slavery, he would be obeyed." Apparently, Diogenes got pretty lucky in who purchased him. His main duty seems to have been to train the sons of Xeniades, teaching them to write and shoot with bow, to sling arrows and hurl javelins, and later to other athletic activities such as wrestling, but only so much as to heighten their color and keep them in good condition. Boys also learned by heart from him many passages from poets, historians, and the writings of Diogenes himself, and he also taught them to be content with plain fare and water to drink, to be mindful of the simple life, a simple appearance, and also to hunt well. It seems the sons had a great regard for Diogenes, and when he died, he was buried by them. Xeniades asked Diogenes how he wished to be buried, and he replied, "On my face." Why, he inquired? Because the world is about to be turned upside down. Likely a reference to the Macedonian rise to power. He seemed to have eschewed the very concept of disability, likely since all men are basically incapable of much. He doesn't seem to have been too hip to disability studies in our sense, but it might be that he held deafness and blindness and other such disabilities to be small matters in the final equality of human beings. What is needed for life is only the bare essentials, or what can be carried in a satchel. Like Socrates, it seems that Diogenes was occasionally beaten for fun by the young and the ignorant on account of his oddness. Afterwards, he entered on the table the names of those who had struck him, and went about with a tablet hung around his neck till he covered them with ridicule and brought universal blame and discredit upon them. He described himself as a hound of sorts which all men praise, but no one, he added, dared to go hunting with him. Why? Because they would always be shown up. When someone boasted that at the Pythian Games he had vanquished men, Diogenes replied, "Nay, I defeat men, you defeat slaves." On old age, he once quipped to those who said, "You are an old man, take a rest." "What?" he replied. "If I were running in the stadium, ought I to slacken my pace when approaching the goal? Ought I not rather to put on speed?" It seems he was sensitive to slights, for having been invited to dinner once, he refused to go, saying the last time he went, the host had not expressed the proper gratitude. He attempted to eat raw meat once to practice even further simplicity, but could not manage to digest it. Famously, when some strangers expressed a wish to see Demosthenes, he stretched out his middle finger and said, "There goes the demagogue of Athens." In his teaching of men, he used to say that he followed the example of trainers of choruses, for they too set the note a little high to ensure that the rest should hit the right note. And he was also a staunch critic of how economic value is attributed. Valuable things, said he, were bartered for things of no value, and vice versa. For example, a statue might fetch 3,000 drachmas, while a quart of barley flour is sold for 2 copper coins. Many of the events related in Diogenes are antics like these. For example, one day he saw a woman kneeling before the gods in an ungraceful attitude, and wishing her to be free of superstition, he came forward and said, "Are you not afraid, my good woman, that a god may be standing behind you? May you not be put to shame?" On property, he reasoned that all things belong to the gods, and that the wise are the friends of the gods, and friends hold all things in common. In other words, all things belong to the wise. Very convenient philosophy indeed for a beggar. He considered himself something of a tragic character, saying all the curses of tragedy had lighted upon him. What may be a citation from his own poetry, he is a homeless exile, to his country dead, a wanderer who begs for his daily bread. To tragic fate or fortune he opposed courage, to convention, nature, and to passion, reason. Alongside the anecdotes concerning Diogenes and Plato, there are also a preponderance of anecdotes concerning Diogenes and Alexander the Great. Alexander is reported as saying, "Had I not been Alexander, I should have liked to be Diogenes." At another time, Diogenes was sunning himself, and Alexander came and stood over him and said, "Ask of me any boon you wish," to which he replied, "Stop shading me. Stop blocking the sun." Though their interactions are cordial, Alexander seems not to have been spared Diogenes' scorn. When he was present at the reception of a letter from Alexander, To Antipater, which had gone through Athleos the messenger, quipped, "Graceless son of graceless sire to graceless wight by graceless squire," managing to insult not only Alexander here, the graceless son, but also his father, Philip, as well as the receiver of the message and the messenger, thus managing to insult 4 people in a single sentence. In another instance, Alexander came and stood opposite him and said, "I am Alexander, the great king." "And I," said he, "am Diogenes the Cynic." Asked what he had done to be called a dog, he replied, "I fawn on those who give me anything, I bark at those who refuse, and I bite the rascals." In another anecdote, Alexander stood opposite him and asked, "Are you not afraid of me?" "Why, what are you?" said he, "a good thing or a bad?" To which Alexander replied, "A good thing." "Who then," said Diogenes, "is afraid of something good?" Someone once tried to argue that Diogenes was a devil with horns, strict deductive method, to which he replied, touching his forehead, "Well, I for my part don't see any." When someone was discoursing on celestial phenomena, he asked, "How many days were you in coming from the sky?" A eunuch had once inscribed on his door the words, "Let nothing evil enter," to which he quipped, "How then is the master of the house to get in?" Quite interestingly, unlike Plato and Aristotle, he wholly rejected the Eleusinian mysteries. The Athenians who loved him urged him to become initiated, so as to enjoy a special privilege in the afterlife. Diogenes, "It would be ludicrous," quoth he, "if Agesilaus and Epaminondas were to dwell in the mire, while certain folk of no account were to live in the Isle of the Blessed because they were initiated." He was asked what the proper time for lunch was. He said, "If a rich man, when you will, if a poor man, when you can." Still, he was loved by the Athenians. Youngsters broke up his barrel. And the Athenians gave the boys a flogging and presented Diogenes with another. How sweet. In another instance, he was dragged off to Macedon for questioning. In front of King Philip, he replied, "A spy upon your insatiable greed," and for this he was admired and set free. Rhetoricians, orators, and others who took up the epithet thrice great, called thrice human, meaning thrice wretched. This is in a way the inspiration for the title of Nietzsche's book, Human All Too Human. Someone reproached him for the crime of adulterated coinage for which he was exiled. He replied, "Nay, it was through that, you miserable fellow, that I came to be a philosopher." He was sometimes seen begging alms from statues, and when asked why he did so, replied, "To get practice in being refused." The love of money he declared to be the mother of all evils. Good men he called the images of the gods, and romantic love the business of the idle. When someone declared that life is an evil, he corrected him, not life itself, but living ill. From this it's clear that for Diogenes, life is a good. Where exactly all these anecdotes fit in a chronological biography of Diogenes is anyone's guess. It seems that before becoming himself a slave, he had slaves, and when one of his slaves ran away, he was advised to go in pursuit of him. He replied, "It would be absurd if Manes can live without Diogenes, but Diogenes cannot get on without Manes." Being asked if the wise eat cakes, he said, "Yes, cakes of all kinds, just like other men." Being asked why people give to beggars but not to philosophers, he said, "Because they think they may one day be lame or blind, but never expect that they will turn to philosophy." When he was begging of a miserly man who was slow to respond, he said, "My friend, it's for food that I am asking, not funeral expenses." And again, being reproached one day for having falsified currency, he said, "That was the time when I was such as you are now, but such as I am now, you will never be." And being reproached for eating openly in the marketplace, something that was not done, said, "Well, it was the marketplace and I felt hungry." Our textbook selection is quite abridged. I've included many interesting anecdotes here from the whole work, many of which have inspired much laughter over the centuries, which is especially seeing the child of a courtesan throw stones at a crowd. He cried out, "Take care lest you hit your father." On being asked what he had gained from philosophy, he replied, "This at least, if nothing else, to be prepared for every fortune." And asked where he came from, he replied, "I am a citizen of the world, a cosmopolites." He seems to be an earlier source for the idea that where death is, we are not. His doctrine of education is also helpful. It is a controlling grace to the young, consolation to the old, wealth to the poor, and ornament to the rich. Being asked what the most beautiful thing in the world was, he replied, "Freedom of speech," again, parrhesia. In his quest for simplicity, he seems to have also argued, quite interestingly, that gymnastic training is the better part of virtue. It makes the acquisition of virtue much easier. And also that nothing in life has any chance of succeeding without strenuous practice. Again, he seems to have believed in the gods and made an interesting argument against private property on that basis. Remember Socrates in the Phaedo saying the gods are our guardian possessors? Diogenes extends this to say that all things belong to the gods, and the gods are friends to the wise, and friends share all property in common. Therefore, all things are property of the wise. That Laertius repeats this argument twice may be significant for reconstructing the political philosophy of Diogenes. It seems he advocated also a true commonwealth as wide as the universe, even in regards to matters of sex and marriage, for he advocated a community of wives recognizing no other marriage than a union of the man who persuades and the woman who consents. In other words, find a partner or partners who will put up with you. On impropriety or impiety, it emerged in the neglect of the soul, but not in specific actions like stealing from a temple or eating the flesh of an animal or even of human flesh. In short, Diogenes had a wonderful gift of persuasion and could equally vanquish anyone he liked in argument. Magical was the spell which the discourses of Diogenes exerted. Said to have been nearly 90 years old when he died. On one account, he was seized with colic after eating an octopus raw. In another, he died voluntarily by holding his breath, and holding his breath withal, for in truth he was rightly named Diogenes, a true-born son of Zeus, a hound of heaven. In yet another version, he was trying to divide the octopus among the dogs, and was severely bitten on the sinew of his foot, which caused his death. This is sort of like Diogenes' Achilles' heel. By this time, at the end of his life, he seems to have been in Corinth. Corinthians honored him with bronze statues, on which verses were inscribed. Time makes even bronze grow old, but thy glory, Diogenes, all eternity will never destroy, since thou alone didst point out to mortals the lessons of self-sufficingness and the easiest path of life. Demetrius asserts that Alexander, in fact, died on the very same day as Diogenes. From these anecdotes, most of which are probably spurious, we have no idea. It seems that later tradition deeply enjoyed the suggestion of an occult relation between Diogenes and Socrates, an antipathy to Plato, a kind of hidden psychological unity between Diogenes and Alexander the Great. None of his works have survived, but here are some of the titles in circulation at the time of titles which were known to Laertius. Although it's not clear if he read any of these, constructing his life of Diogenes, this book concludes strangely, the suggestion that Diogenes always had a sleek appearance owing to his use of unguents. There are some things known about ancient Cynicism beyond these anecdotes on Diogenes, but not a lot. So let's next turn with Hadot to Pyrrho of Elis, eponymous founder of what would come to be known as Pyrrhonian Skepticism. Pyrrho was a contemporary of Diogenes and Alexander. In fact, he went along with Alexander in his expedition to India, where he met some Oriental sages, and he too can be considered a quite extravagant Socrates. He also did not devote himself to teaching, but was skilled in the art of dialogue, and it seems he did not write, attracted disciples who wished to imitate his way of life. His behavior was completely unpredictable, sometimes retiring into complete solitude, at other times traveling without telling anyone, and talking to whoever he met along the way as traveling and conversation partners. He confronted all kinds of risks and dangers, defying prudence, and kept talking even when his audience had gone. Famously, he one day saw his master, Anarchus, who had fallen in a swamp, and he continued on his way without helping him, and the master congratulated him for his indifference and insensitivity. A difference between Pyrrho and Diogenes the Cynic, however, that Pyrrho seemed to have behaved in a more simple manner, in perfect conformity with the lifestyle of other people. His intention was not to be a gadfly. He lived piously with his sister, who was a midwife, and sometimes went to the market to sell chickens or pigs. He did housekeeping with indifference, and is said to have bathed a pig with indifference too. Hadot draws a connection to Taoism and the life of Shuangzi, who for 3 years also locked himself up, performing household tasks for his wife and serving food to the pigs, as he would to men, saying he was indifferent to everything and had eliminated all ornamentation in order to discover simplicity. The Cynic way of life can be summed up in terms of learning from nature and radical freedom of speech. The Pyrrhonic way of life is summed up in one word: indifference. Pyrrho was indifferent to everything and always tried to remain in the same state. In other words, with no emotion or change in his disposition under the influence of external things. He attached no importance to the fact that he was present at such and such a place or meeting such and such a person. Made no distinction between what is usually considered dangerous and what is harmless, between tasks judged to be superior and those considered inferior, between suffering and pleasure or between life and death. For the judgments people make about the value of such things are based on mere convention. In fact, it is impossible to know whether a given thing is good or bad in itself. Pyrrho's ultimate advice for how we should live is to cultivate indifference. Unhappiness comes from the fact that we want to obtain what we think is good for us and to escape what we think is bad. If we refuse this kind of distinction between things and refrain from making value judgments about them or preferring one thing to another, that is, in his famous maxim, if we say, "This is no better than that," we will achieve peace and inner tranquility. Even no longer feel the need to talk about things, that is, to weigh them in the scale of human values. It doesn't really matter what we do so long as we do it with an attitude of indifference. The goal of philosophy is to seek stability in a state of perfect equality with ourselves, complete indifference, inner freedom, and impassiveness, a state that he identifies with the divine. Everything is indifferent except indifference itself, which has ultimate value. It is therefore the source of virtue. To acquire such indifference is no easy task, for it means liberating ourselves entirely from the merely human point of view. The goal of Pyrrhonian skepticism is to acquire the view from nowhere, and Hadot comments that such a perspective is in a way inhuman. It reveals the nudity of existence beyond partial oppositions and false values, and aims for a state of simplicity prior to all distinctions. If we fail to achieve this total disinvestiture, we must train ourselves with inner discourse. The usefulness of philosophy, in other words, is only to remind us that this is no better than that, argument itself being valuable only as a stepping stone to indifference. Pyrrho sought solitude and practiced meditation, sometimes speaking aloud to himself, and when he was asked why he pursued all these useless activities, replied, "I am training to become useful." Such practices may have been acquired through contact with Hindu sages on the expedition to India with Alexander. They may also have been acquired through an emulation of the Cynics. In short, we don't really have the philosophy of Pyrrho except through the lived example of anecdotes. From this we can only conclude that Pyrrho, like Socrates and the Cynics, lived philosophy as an exercise in transforming one's way of life. Let's turn now away from the biographical towards the philosophy of skepticism. The first thing to note here is that the skeptic doctrine of living conformably to appearances has very different consequences for the religious domain depending on where we look. As we heard already, for Pyrrho, the skeptic way of life is the closest to the divine. But in later skeptical treatises, such as Sextus Empiricus, the very existence of the gods is called into question. But in other skeptics, such as Cicero or Marcus Aurelius, the practice of skepticism is seen as germane to traditional religious experience and ritual. Everything hinges on how we understand the aim or purpose of the skeptical epoché or reduction. Invariably, whether in Pyrrhonian or academic skepticism, it brings all knowledge into question, either arguing that human knowledge is ultimately foundationless, that our knowledge is flawed in some fundamental way, or more subtly in Sextus, we can't even say that for certain. The ethical goal of living in accordance with nature and practicing skepticism regarding our beliefs is again ataraxia, freedom from disturbance or happiness, eudaimonia. And in some authors such as Cicero, the epistemic goal is to live in accordance with appearance, where appearances might indeed include accepting and practicing traditional religious observances, perhaps even certain appearances or revelations of the gods. I'll be drawing here from the discussion on skepticism in Melkirk's textbook, The Great Conversation, as I think it makes the basic positions of skepticism a bit more accessible than some of these recondite primary sources. Melkirk begins his discussion of the philosophy of skepticism with the question, what has skepticism to do with happiness, eudaimonia, or ataraxia? For we are apt to suppose that someone who doesn't know, or at least thinks he doesn't know, must on that account be unhappy. Aristotle, who holds that all men by nature desire to know, would surely think so. Moreover, we are almost all brought up as believers in something or other. Belief is as natural to us as breathing. What sense does it therefore make to suspend all our beliefs, to get rid of all our habits? How could that possibly make us happy? The ancient skeptics give some surprising answers to these perplexing questions. Although we don't get much about the epistemological basis of skepticism studying Pyrrho, his pupil Timon is reported to have said, the nature of things is indeterminable, i.e. we cannot determine that things are more like this than they are like that. Melkirk roots this principle in the conversation concerning appearance and reality from pre-Socratic philosophy through Aristotle. Appearances often deceive us, so many thinkers turn to intelligence or reason to discern reality. Parmenides concludes that what is truly real is the one, Democritus, that it is atoms in the void, Plato that it is the world of the forms, and Aristotle that it is individual substances which are composites of matter and form. It is precisely this diversity of answers which motivates the Pyrrhonist skeptic. If the great philosophers can't agree on the most basic things, then what value is their work? Simply that through gathering their disagreements and showing the insoluble aporias entailed within, must conclude that in some fundamental way, knowledge is unattainable. This principle that human knowledge is somehow impossible is not even avowed so directly by the Pyrrhonian skeptics, however, for even to affirm that we can have no knowledge is a kind of dogmatism. This is what will distinguish the most radical proponents of skepticism from so-called academic skepticism, which was an offshoot of Plato's own academy, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, prima facie, the fact of disagreement does not prove that reality cannot be known. Some views of the real might very well be correct and others mistaken. Perhaps none of them are correct, and some future doctrine will discover the truth. And so, to support Timon's principle that the nature of things is indeterminable, we must say more. It is here that later Pyrrhonists systematize arguments in favor of skeptical conclusions. Depending on the type of claim being proposed, there are various modes of skeptical reason that should be deployed, all aiming at the conclusion that we should suspend judgment. These 10 modes and some of their variations are discussed in our selection from Diogenes Laertius's Life of Pyrrho this week, but Melkirk suggests, and I concur, that our best source for a survey of the 10 modes is Sextus Empiricus, who lived in the 2nd century CE. Let's just look here at a few of them. Sextus was a 2nd century CE Pyrrhonian skeptic writing in Greek. Eventually in the 16th century, as we'll see, his works were translated into Latin and had a stunning effect on the development of the modern worldview. On one level, he affirms the epistemological view that we lack knowledge in some fundamental way. But on another, unlike the academic skeptics, he suspends judgment concerning even this. The point of this suspension of judgment is to point us towards ethics, as a realm in which we are limited to appearances, such that when we live conformably to appearances, we can live happily. The core of skeptic epistemology, or we should say meta-epistemology, is found in the various articulations of the 10 modes of reasoning. The first stresses the unreliability of sense impressions, points to how the sense organs of animals differ from species to species. What appears one way to us looks very different in the multifaceted eye of a fly, the echolocation of a bat. Cats see much better than we do in the dark, and dogs smell many things that escape our senses. St. Augustine will say, after his skeptical phase, that it is at the very least indisputable that things appear in a certain way to me. For example, that I find the temperature in the room to be cold. This is known as the veridicality or the truthfulness of perception to the one perceiving it. But this in itself tells us nothing about the object external to the senses, or the qualities that inhere in it. Eventually, modern philosophy will distinguish between primary qualities which inhere in the object itself and secondary qualities which inhere only in the subject perceiving it, such as in John Locke's Empiricism. But in the first instance, the first mode of reasoning leading to suspension of judgment, although basic, is quite valuable. All living creatures on planet Earth may be part of one common world, the biosphere or Gaian system. Each thing within the world is perceived radically differently depending on our perspective and the constitution of our sense organs. We should suspend judgment not about the way things appear to us, this is indisputable, but rather regarding what they are in themselves. On the first mode, Sextus writes, "The same things appear different owing to the variety in animals, we shall indeed be able to state our own impressions of the real objects. As to its essential nature, we should suspend judgment. For we cannot ourselves judge between our own impressions and those of other animals, since we ourselves are involved in the dispute and are, therefore, rather in need of a judge who is more competent to pass judgment than ourselves. In other words, we are biased. If then, owing to the variety in animals, their sense impressions differ, and it is impossible to judge between them, we must necessarily suspend judgment regarding the external underlying objects." That is what Aristotle had called the hypokaimenon. To suspend judgment in this sense of skepticism is to refrain from assenting or dissenting, from committing oneself to a yes or no, or any belief concerning reality. Indeed, according to the skeptic, as long as we care about having true beliefs and getting it right, we will be disturbed and liable to be upset by contrary opinions. However, if we suspend judgment, we can live according to appearances and the customs of our culture, and thus be happy. The second mode in Sextus concerns differences among human beings, especially concerning objects of choice, desire and aversion. Sextus writes, "Seeing then that choice and avoidance depend on pleasure and displeasure, While pleasure and displeasure depend on sensation and sense impression, whenever some men choose the very things which are avoided by others, it is logical for us to conclude that they are also differently affected by the same things, since otherwise they would all alike have chosen or avoided the same things. But if the same objects affect men differently, owing to the differences in men, then on this ground also we shall reasonably be led to the suspension of judgment. For while we are, no doubt, able to state what each of the underlying objects appears to be, relatively to each difference, we are incapable of explaining what they are in reality. For here we will have to choose between believing all men or some. But if we believe all, we shall be attempting the impossible and accepting contradictories, and if we believe some, let us be told whose opinions we are to endorse. The message here is the same: we should suspend judgment. In short, in terms of the appearance-reality distinction, the skeptic restricts himself to appearance. These are just the first two modes. Some of the others are concerned with the dependence of appearance on various circumstances, as well as differences in customs and laws. In addition to the 10 modes regarding sense impression and ethics, also more formal modes of argumentation which the skeptic employs, which are standard ways of criticizing the arguments of the dogmatic philosophers. Here, a skeptic considers that anyone who affirms what is not is evidently dogmatic. In essence, the dogmatism makes grandiose claims about what is not evident, and in the final analysis, indemonstrable. To be dogmatic in this sense is to claim that you know something for which you have no evidence. And according to the skeptics, all the schools of philosophy are dogmatic in this sense. The most important theoretical argument deployed against the dogmatic philosophers by the skeptics is infinite regress and circular reasoning. Melkirk explains it in simplest outline. Suppose A is supported by the claim B. The skeptic will ask what supports B. If B is supported by C, and C by D, and so on forever, we have an infinite regress. Alternatively, if B is supported by C and C by A, we have circular reasoning. The argument leads always back to where it began. In neither case can we claim to know that A is true. According to the skeptics, all dogmatic claims concerning reality are in principle subject to infinite regress and circular reasoning. The first 10 modes concerned with sensible and ethical suspension of judgment. These more theoretical modes of reasoning we can call theoretical epoche. Sextus explains this as follows: the matter proposed is either a sense object or a thought object, but whichever it is an object of controversy. For some say that only sensibles are true, others only intelligibles, others that some sensibles and some intelligible objects are true. They then assert that the controversy can or cannot be decided. If they say it cannot, we have it granted that we must suspend judgment. But if they say it can be decided, we must always ask by what criteria is this matter to be decided. In Protagoras' term, what is the measure by which we're to judge this? As Melkirk notes, skepticism becomes a necessity in the Hellenistic world because claims to knowledge are a dime a dozen. The world is full of people who think they know what's what, either regarding what is close to them and concerns them, or regarding the very nature and structure of the whole of reality or nature, and even God. But by what mark or standard or criterion are we to decide where truth and knowledge really lie? Different philosophies offer different solutions, and the skeptic argues, never decide between them which is more true. No satisfactory criteria will ever be found. The problem of the criterion goes a little like this. Suppose we claim to know something, let's call it P. We might then be asked about the criterion or standard by which we decide that P is something we know. Either that criterion is something we also claim to know, or it is not. If we do not claim to know it, then the proper response is to suspend judgment concerning P. If we do claim to know it, we can be asked by what criterion we know it. If we do claim to know the criterion, we can be asked by what criterion we know the criterion. And so on, the question repeats itself. And this iteration will either go in a circle coming back to something earlier, in which case we should suspend judgment, or it will go on forever in an infinite regress, in which case we should also suspend judgment. In any case, according to the skeptics, the correct response is to suspend judgment and make no claims to know what is true. The criterion of truth is indeed the deepest problem that skepticism bequeaths to all later history of philosophy. Having established all these doctrinal tendencies and various schools with their associated way of life, how can we decide between the various philosophies on the basis of truth? And if we can't, is not skepticism the only valid philosophy? Sextus broaches this issue very lucidly when he writes, "Of those then who have treated of the criterion, some have declared that a criterion exists. The Stoics, for example, and certain others, while by some its existence is denied, as for example by Xenophanes of Colophon, who says, "Over all things opinion bears sway." We, the skeptics, have adopted suspension of judgment as to whether it does or does not exist. Sextus is not arguing there is no criterion of truth, just that we can't know whether there is or not. He goes on, "This dispute, then, they will declare to be either capable or incapable of decision. And if they say it is incapable of decision, they will be granting on the spot the propriety of the suspension of judgment. But if they say it admits of decision, let them tell us whereby it is to be decided. Since we, the skeptics, have no accepted criterion, and do not even know, but are still inquiring whether any criterion exists." Here the skeptic is very open to being persuaded. In fact, many skeptics would very much like to be persuaded. When they evaluate the arguments given for a specific criterion of truth, they will remain skeptics insofar as they are not persuaded. Are any arguments for the ultimate reality of the world in fact convincing? Not being persuaded is a skeptic's natural starting point. For in order to decide the dispute which has arisen about the criterion, we must possess an accepted criterion by which we shall be able to judge the dispute. And in order to possess an accepted criterion, the dispute about the criterion must first be decided. That was pretty difficult to understand, so let's look at this "is there a criterion of truth" flowchart according to Sextus Empiricus. First question, is there a criterion for truth? If not, suspend judgment. If yes, it is X, we must ask, is there a criterion for deciding whether X is the criterion of truth? If not, we should suspend judgment. If yes, someone will say it is Y. But is there a criterion to decide whether Y is the criterion for deciding whether X is the criterion of truth? If no, then suspend judgment. But if yes, it is Z, then what about the justification of the criterion Z? If someone goes on to say it's W, that's an infinite regress, and we should suspend judgment. If someone goes on to say it is X, mentioned earlier, then that is circular reasoning, and we should suspend judgment. In other words, the best course of action for the skeptic is to suspend judgment. Now, on the face of it, you might be tempted to say that skepticism is its own kind of dogmatism, for it seems to have worked out in advance exactly how it will dispense with any truth claims regarding the sensible or intelligible worlds. But this would be a misreading of Pyrrhonian skepticism and of Sextus Empiricus. For what is presented here is not a dogma, but rather a method. The purest type of skeptic does not presuppose we must inevitably wind up in infinite regress, circular reasoning, or suspended judgment. They are in principle open to the notion that there might be a criterion of truth, but simply have not seen one demonstrated sufficiently. So Sextus does not claim there is no criterion of truth, while his attitude is that until a criterion of truth can be decisively proposed and demonstrated, the best attitude of the philosopher is one of non-commitment. Skepticism, with its method of epoché, thus becomes the school in which reason itself is most primordially cultivated. There are, however, inconsistencies here in the legends concerning skepticism and its founder, Pyrrho of Elis, and the actual practices of later skeptics. The legendary figure of Pyrrho is described almost comically as someone who lived his philosophy, that nothing is any more one thing than it is anything else. But there are dissenting voices regarding this legendary reconstruction. As well, later skeptics appeared almost unanimously to cohere with the notion that we can live and live well by restricting ourselves to the way that things appear. Though there is no criteria for distinguishing reality and appearance, there is such a criterion for life and action. And this is the practical criterion, which is to live in accordance with appearances. Adhering then to appearances, we live in accordance with the normal rules of life, undogmatically, and within ordinary activity. It's interesting that Sextus Empiricus himself was, like Aristotle, a physician's son. Recall how Aristotle from his father developed a passion for observation of the real empirical world. This is not very far from Sextus's skepticism. Perhaps the true doctor is unwilling to speculate about the real nature of a disease, for example, but restricts themselves to what they observe, that is, to appearances, and how to change them in the direction of health. If Aristotle did have a fundamental doubt regarding the principles of Plato's philosophy, most of which he took over and adapted, rather than wholly rejecting, then he might have become a good skeptic under different circumstances. And in a way, the skeptical idea of living conformably to appearances and applying theories only within the play of appearances is precisely the empirical attitude of modern science, Within empirical medicine, speculative theories indeed get in the way, and this is true also in the fundamental sciences. Both practical and theoretical reason ought to live wholly in accordance with what appears, without importing a total world conception, which in application invariably results in misdiagnosis, misapprehension, and actions not conformable to reality. When we consider the Pyrrhonist skeptic to be a practical relativist, much more powerfully than in the sophist movement, relativism is again, past Plato and Aristotle, reborn. It is not reborn as a doctrine claiming to be the truth about things, but rather emerges as an epistemological and an ethical doctrine. There really is no alternative to the suspension of judgment regarding ultimate things. The problem of the criterion is unsolvable, and so skepticism is an epistemic virtue. And ethically, so long as we're seeking certainty or in doubt regarding the true nature of things, we will be perturbed, and so long as we are perturbed, we will be unhappy. To find quietude and happiness, we must give up the search for certainty, cease to be dogmatists, and become skeptics. So skepticism is not only an epistemological virtue, but also an ethical one. Skepticism is the furthest possible thing from a New Age philosophy that believes we can overcome the trials and tribulations of life. Those are inevitable. But skepticism can help us to endure them without making them worse with suspect ideas and preconceived dogmas. At first glance, skepticism seems to be a rather gray, dim, and dark or indifferent view of the world. It lacks the noble-spirited or high view of happiness, the indefatigable optimism of Plato's forms, or Aristotle's notion that the ethical life involves the activity of the soul in accordance with excellence. Melkirk wonders whether perhaps the times in which skepticism emerged to popularity did not realistically allow for more. But in any case, regardless of whether we avow a skeptical way of life as an ethical idea, the epistemological problem of the criterion remains. And this is the great contribution of skepticism, its value in the subsequent history of Western philosophy. Many of the most important philosophers reckoning with it in a fundamental way, including St. Augustine, Descartes, Michel de Montaigne, and Hegel, who all stand out. First off, we can see Christian faith in St. Augustine as a response to skepticism. Can skeptical objections be met? Augustine believes they can, and decisively so. There are in fact three things we know with absolute certainty. As Augustine writes, and you might note here, pre-form of Descartes, the certainty that I exist, that I know it, and that I am glad of it is independent of any imaginary and deceptive fantasies. In respect of these truths, I have no fear of the arguments of the academics, here referring to the academic skeptics. They say, suppose you are mistaken. I reply, if I am mistaken, I exist. In other words, the first form of the cogito argument is not I think, therefore I am, but I err, therefore I am. A non-existent being cannot be mistaken, therefore I must exist if I am mistaken. Then, since my being mistaken proves that I exist, how can I be mistaken in thinking that I exist, seeing that my mistake establishes my existence? Since, therefore, I must exist in order to be mistaken, then even if I am mistaken, there can be no doubt that I am not mistaken in my knowledge that I exist. So the first absolute certainty, I exist, and the second, I know that I exist, and even the third, that I am glad that I know these two things. For I cannot either be mistaken about the fact of my gladness, nor about the fact that I love the things I love. For even if they were illusory, it would still be a fact that I love those illusions. Melkirk reads this as meaning that knowledge, certainty, and truth are available, at least to a small extent, and skepticism is mistaken. Next question is whether we can know more than this. And here, like the Platonic philosophers, Augustine turns to mathematics, such as the famous example of Kant, 2 + 2 is 4. It's true independently of the mind that thinks it and cannot be otherwise. To refute skeptic ethics, we have to also ask if there are practical truths, and to this, Augustine poses a series of leading questions. Do you really propose to deny that the incorrupt is better than the corrupt, the eternal better than the temporal, the inviolable better than the violable? So long as these are terms to which we can apply any meaning, Pyrrho's indifference, everything is neither more one thing than another, appears manifestly ridiculous, and of course this leads Augustine back to the certainty of divine truth. More subtly, Augustine elsewhere critiques the skeptic's ethical position as enabling, yes, the ancient skeptic claims, to live conformably to appearances and the laws of his state. Without a more robust ethical doctrine, bad actions like adultery and vices are not foreclosed but might be in accordance with the given epoche of appearances. The skeptic ethical position is to a large extent beyond good and evil, merely rooted in custom, naturally makes it quite problematic for Augustine. Even within Augustine's defeat of skepticism, it continues, in the early church fathers and the history of Christian theology, to serve a valuable propedeutic function, clearing away the rigorous systematicity of pagan philosophies. The paradoxical upshot of skepticism is that it paved the way to Christian faith. This was again how skepticism was utilized when it became more widely studied in the 16th century. In 1562, the first Latin edition of the work of Sextus Empiricus was published. This was an era in which very few people read Greek. Within 7 years, all of his writings were available, some translated by Catholics and others by Protestants, the outlines being translated by a Catholic and against the professors by a Protestant. The 16th century was also a time of great intellectual upheaval and the beginnings of the scientific revolution based on Cartesian science, and in this context, Pyrrhonism struck a responsive chord in nuanced thinkers that were still more committed to Catholic faith. Significantly, Michel de Montaigne, sometimes called the French Shakespeare although an essayist, was a Frenchman of noble birth who, after spending some years in public service as a magistrate, retired at the age of 38 to think and write. For a little on Montaigne's skepticism, we can look to this highly readable book by Sarah Bakewell, How to Live or A Life of Montaigne, in 1 question and 20 attempts at an answer. The chapter on Montaigne's skepticism begins, set alongside Stoicism and Epicureanism, skepticism looks like the odd one out. Like the others, it amounted to a form of therapy. This at least was true of Pyrrhonian skepticism. How the writings on skepticism in Diogenes Laertius and Sextus Empiricus were received during this period is related by an anecdote about Montaigne's near contemporary and the first French translator of Sextus, Henri Estienne, and how he reacted to his encounter with Sextus's outlines. Working in his library one day, but feeling too ill and tired to do his usual work, he found a copy while browsing through an old box of manuscripts. As soon as he started reading, he found himself laughing so heartily that his weariness left him and his intellectual energy returned. Bakewell comments that the work did not so much instruct or convince its readers, but give them the giggles. It is not on the face of it a very intelligible reaction. If you try to read Sextus in the textbook this week, you'll see it's very plodding and prosaic. Nevertheless, the skeptics did use sprightly examples, as philosophy books often do. Their writings were not wildly comic. Skepticism evoked the giggles in this cultural context because it was an era full of people parading inflated ideas of human importance, and for this the skeptics were the perfect antidote. The key to the trick is the revelation that nothing in life needs to be taken seriously, and Pyrrhonism doesn't even take itself seriously. Ordinary dogmatic skepticism, the academic school, asserted the impossibility of knowledge, summed up in Socrates' remarks, "All I know is that I know nothing." Pyrrhonian skepticism starts from this point but adds an effect, and I'm not even sure about that. For the thinkers of the late Renaissance, this was wildly funny, and in Montaigne, the I suspend judgment of skepticism becomes his own personal je soutiens or I hold back. The face of it, this sounds about as uplifting as Stoic or Epicurean notions of indifference. But like the other Hellenistic ideas, it works, and that is all that matters. The epoche functions almost like one of those puzzling Zen koans, brief, enigmatic notions or unanswerable questions, such as what is the sound of one hand clapping? At first, such utterances caused nothing but perplexity, yet later they open a path to all-encompassing wisdom. Bakewell quotes 3 maxims from Sextus. I cannot say which of the things proposed I should find convincing, and which I should not find convincing. I now feel in such a way as neither to posit dogmatically, nor to reject any of the things falling under this investigation, and to every account I have scrutinized which purports to establish something in dogmatic fashion, there appears to me opposed another account purporting to establish something in dogmatic fashion, equal to it in convincingness or lack of convincingness. Skepticism is still both epistemologically and morally relevant to us, especially when we are in positions of uncertainty or double jeopardy. Is it all right to lie to someone to make them feel better? I suspend judgment, or epoche. Is my cat better looking than your cat? Am I kinder than you? Does love make one happy? Is there such a thing as a just war? I suspend judgment. And it goes further. A real Pyrrhonian will suspend judgment even in response to questions that ordinary folk might think have an obvious answer. Do hens lay eggs? Do other people really exist? Am I looking at a cup of coffee at this moment? It is epoche all the way. In this way, the skeptics were emulated as models of playfulness and a contrarian disposition. As Montaigne wrote of them, if you postulate that snow is black, they argue on the contrary that it is white. If you say that it is neither one nor the other, it is up to them to maintain that it is both. If you maintain with certain judgment that you know nothing about it, they will maintain that you do. yes, and if by an affirmative axiom you assure them that you are in doubt about it, they will go on and argue that you are not, or that you cannot judge and prove that you are in doubt. Such responses could be either infuriating or quite charming, and all Pyrrho renounced, according to Montaigne, was the pretension most people fall prey to, that of being able to regiment, arrange, and fix truth. And this is what really interested Montaigne in the skeptical tradition, not so much the skeptic's extreme approach to warding off pains and sorrows, for here he found the Stoic and Epicurean ethics to be more closely tuned to real life. Their desire to take everything provisionally and questioningly, as their intense emphasis on questionability and the question-worthiness of everything we experience, was simply not to be surpassed. And this is just what Montaigne tried to do himself. To keep this goal in the forefront of his mind, he had a series of medals struck in 1576 featuring Sextus's magic word epoche, here appearing as epeko, together with his own family arms and an emblem of weighing the scales. The scales being another Pyrrhonian symbol designed to remind us to maintain balance and weigh things up rather than merely accepting them. If you go to the Montaigne house, you can still see other skeptical statements and maxims carved into the wood beams in his library. This way, although a good Catholic all his life, Montaigne was a committed skeptic at the same time. His essays are suffused with skepticism, their pages filled with words such as perhaps, to some extent, I think, it seems to me, phrases which, as Montaigne mentions, soften and moderate the rashness of our propositions and embody what the critic Hugo Friedrich has called a philosophy of unassuming,ness. For Montaigne, we must really strain our souls to be aware of our own fallibility. In our own cultural context, without much study, we tend to assume that skepticism is allied with reason and science against superstition and religion. But in Montaigne's time, it was the exact opposite. And it was not until the Enlightenment that skepticism came to ally itself with science and progress. In the 16th century, Christian churches, favoring faith over rational theology, saw in Pyrrhonian skepticism a natural ally. Both skepticism and Christianity attacked human arrogance. Pyrrhonian skepticism was especially useful against the innovation of Protestantism for the Catholics, which prioritized private reasoning and conscience rather than dogma. Thus, for several decades, Catholicism embraced Pyrrhonism and held up books such as Henri Estienne's Sextus translation or Montaigne's essay as valuable antidotes to heresy. Of course, the spirit of the age here would quite quickly change, such that by the time Descartes published his Meditations, skepticism was no longer seen by Catholicism as an ally. In any case, the early Montaigne was embraced by the Orthodox as a pious skeptical sage, a new Pyrrho as well as a new Seneca, the author of a book at once consoling and morally improving. It comes as a surprise, therefore, to discover that by the end of the following century, he was shunned with horror and that the essays were consigned to the index of prohibited books, there to stay for almost 180 years. Most clearly summing up the inner alliance of religion and skepticism, Montaigne writes, "The plague of man is the opinion of knowledge. This is why ignorance is so recommended by our religion as a quality suitable to belief and obedience." Skepticism makes its next most important entry onto the stage of world history and modern philosophy in René Descartes, who is the furthest thing from a skeptic, rather a rational foundationalist, but who nevertheless utilizes the methods of Pyrrhonist skeptical doubt as a necessary ordeal on the path to certain knowledge in his Meditations. Doubting the truth of all that the senses reveal, and even the truths of the mind, there might be an evil genius deceiving us, he nevertheless concurs in Augustine's discovery of clear and distinct ideas, absolute certainties which cannot be doubted, adapting Augustine's own argument in his Cogito or the French Je pense, donc je suis. Skepticism in Descartes is not of an academic kind. It is certainly not a commitment to non-knowledge, but rather a Pyrrhonist suspension or epoche used merely as a preliminary stage. And Cartesian rationalism or foundationalism thus had a twofold effect. On the one hand, it legitimated the new science and philosophy based on absolute certainty, but on the other, it raised the specter of further possible skeptical doubts for those who disagreed with the dogmatic outcomes of the Cartesian meditation and system. In fact, it is within Diogenes Laertius's Life of Pyrrho, as well as Sextus Empiricus, that the seeds for an adequate refutation of Descartes' meditations can already be found. Speaking of the lack of a criterion of truth and of the fundamental antinomies of reason, Laertius asks a question very relevant for the Cartesian legacy. Perhaps our opponent will say, are then appearances trustworthy or deceitful? We answer that if they are trustworthy, i.e. Descartes' clear and distinct ideas, then the other side has nothing to object to those to whom contrary appearances present themselves. Were Descartes' notions really so clear and distinct? Well, that may well depend on what appeared to the man Descartes. For as he who says that such and such a thing appears to him as trustworthy, so also there is he who says that the contrary appears to him. And if appearances are deceitful, then they do not deserve any confidence when they assert what appears to them to be true. This completely undermines the very principle that there could be clear and distinct ideas beyond the skeptical epoche of perspective. And here even Augustine seems to be a better skeptic than Descartes. He notes as his third certainty that he loves the things he loves, or the things that appear trustworthy to him, even if they be illusions. In short, Descartes' evil genius cannot, in theory, unless we solve the problem of the criteria, really be dispelled from our image of thought. This is why Descartes' meditations eventually brought up so much controversy. For the skeptics already, we must not assume that what convinces us is actually true. For the same thing does not convince everyone, nor even the same people, always. Persuasiveness sometimes depends on external circumstances, on the reputation of the speaker, on his ability as a thinker or his artfulness, and on the familiarity or pleasantness of the topic. And this, which we again read in Laertius, indeed applies well to the history of the reception of Descartes' meditations. Skeptic going well beyond Descartes' principles properly destroys the criterion itself, for even the criterion has either been critically determined or not, and if it has not, it is definitely untrustworthy. The next most significant stop in the impact of skepticism on modern philosophy, here skipping a lot, such as the works of Bale, is the role it plays in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In this monumental and grandiose narrative, the negativity of life inherent in Stoicism, since there is so much we can't control, and so much of our freedom is illusion before fate, eventually leads to what Hegel understands as the pure negativity of skepticism. Furthermore, the inadequacy of skepticism leads to the unhappy conscience, and this in turn to Christianity. As Melchior writes in Hegel, skepticism is the realization of that which Stoicism was only the notion, and is the first actual experience of what the freedom of thought is. This is, however, in itself, in the first instance, the negative, and must exhibit itself as such. In Hegel's own words, what skeptical self-consciousness recognizes is its freedom lying in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence, and at another time equally admits to a relapse into occupying itself with what is unessential. It affirms the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc., but is itself a seeing and hearing, etc. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles, yet lets its conduct be guided by these very principles. Its deeds and its words belie one another. So in short, according to Hegel, skeptical self-consciousness is mired in a deep self-deception. Priding itself on its freedom, it becomes slave to the customs of the society in which it finds itself, whatever they happen to be. Hegel also provides an interesting solution to the problem of the criterion of truth in Sextus Empiricus. According to his method for the study of the development of spiritual consciousness, phenomenology is the discipline that traces the dialectical succession of ever more adequate stages of consciousness. What this means is that the problem of the criterion is solved in the dialectical unfolding of consciousness as such, as phenomenology. In Hegel's words, consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of an inquiry. For it is precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter at hand, knowledge, as it is in and for itself. Melchior glosses this: there is no need for philosophers to come up with a criterion for knowledge, because the problem of the criterion is in the process of solving itself, that is, within the dialectical phenomenology of consciousness. Nor should we despair because it seems we cannot compare our thoughts with their objects and test them definitively for their correctness. In examining its own adequacy, consciousness is continually engaged in such a comparison and testing. For Hegel, all that is left to do is for us to simply look on. He claims that by pursuing philosophy this way, by simply looking on, phenomenologically, we will see the criterion for knowledge develop naturally and necessarily from within consciousness itself. More simply, the criterion of truth becomes the truthfulness consciousness acquires in its dialectical succession to ever more adequate stages of itself. Beyond Hegelian phenomenology, methods of skeptical suspension of judgment, or epoche, become even more central to later European philosophy, both in the analytic and the continental tradition. In continental philosophy, Edmund Husserl picks up Descartes' method of Pyrrhonian skepticism in order to articulate a new vision of phenomenology as simple description of the contents of consciousness, phenomena, what the ancient skeptics called appearances. This centrality of skeptical inquiry and investigation, and its method of phenomenological reduction, is then taken up into the foundations of Heidegger's being and time, especially in its method of the phenomenological destruction, destruction or dismantling, of the reified, ossified, and sclerotic findings of traditional ontology. Before turning to Cicero's text on the nature of the gods and the Hellenistic philosophy of religion, let's turn back briefly to Hadot on the difference between Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism. It was by the middle of the 3rd century BCE that Arcelius became the head of the Platonic Academy, and at this point the school went back to Socrates. Philosophical discourse once again becoming critical, questioning, and aporetic. Like Pyrrho, Arcelius, the founder of academic skepticism, wrote nothing. His teaching method consisted in using argumentation to refute the theses that his auditors were invited to suggest. Unlike Pyrrhonian skepticism, academic skepticism proposed an antinomial image of thought. When a specific thesis was proposed, it set about demonstrating the opposite could very well be proved, and thus showed the impossibility of making affirmations that are capable of attaining absolute certainty and truth. We must therefore suspend all judgment, but this does not mean we must suspend all our research and critical activity. For, like Socrates, the academic skeptic, as sage, must relentlessly inquire. Human happiness consists precisely in this, the never-ending quest for knowledge. Or as Plato articulated in the Symposium, true humility in the consciousness of the limits of one's knowledge is godlike in itself. According to Arcelius, what Plato had in fact seen, despite himself, is that human beings cannot accede to absolute knowledge. The dream of a vision from outside the cave, merely the construction of an ideal illusion. Like Socrates, Arcelius taught nothing, but also like Socrates, he troubled and fascinated his auditors. He educated them by teaching them to free themselves from their prejudice, developing their critical sense and inviting them, as Socrates did, to question themselves. Hadot notes a key difference here, for although Socrates and Arcelius both denounced false knowledge and false certainty, Socrates criticized the opinions and prejudices of so-called philosophers, i.e. the sophists, and of non-philosophers. Arcelius, by contrast, criticized primarily the false knowledge and false certainties of the dogmatic philosophers. The position of academic skepticism is that moral life has no need to be based on principles and justified by philosophical discourse. Instead, Arcelius, like Socrates and Plato, accepts that human beings have within them a fundamental innate desire for the good and a natural tendency to act in a way which is good. By purifying themselves of all opinion and completely suspending their judgment, philosophers can thus rediscover their natural tendencies, which precede all speculation. If we follow these tendencies, and it is reasonable to yield to them, then moral action will be justified. So the academic skeptics, even in their theoretical epoche or suspension of absolute knowledge, maintained in their ethical doctrine very optimistic fundamental dogmatism, that is the goodness of human nature. And ancient writers generally agreed in recognizing Arcelius's extraordinary goodness and the delicacy with which he practiced benevolence. His successors, Carneades and Philo of Larissa, the Academy evolved in the direction of probabilism. It is in the lineage going through academic skepticism that we must locate Cicero and his treatise on the nature of God, among other works. In fact, it is through Cicero that academic skepticism came to exert an enormous influence in modern philosophy, that is thanks to the great success of his philosophical works, both in the Renaissance and in modern times. In his writings, we can observe academic philosophy at work. It left to the individual the freedom to choose, in each concrete case, the attitude which he judged to be the best according to the circumstance, whether this attitude was inspired by Stoicism, Epicureanism, or another philosophy, and Cicero refrained from imposing a mode of conduct dictated by principles in advance. So in Cicero's application of academic skepticism, the skeptic's way of life, defined by the good and essential goodness, indeed allows a limited avowal of the findings of the various schools of philosophy on a case-by-case basis. It's not the radical epoche and the epoche concerning this epoche in Pyrrhonian skepticism, but rather a more limited application of the method of skepticism, which in theory permits a more limited avowal of a complete picture of the world, so long as it is subject to revision and change. And this explains why Cicero, a card-carrying academic skeptic, in his dialogue on the nature of the gods, concludes the work by supporting the Stoic view of religion and the gods over and against the skeptical critique he just leveled against it. Cicero often boasted of the freedom of the academic who is not bound by any system. In his words, "We academics live from day to day. That is, we make our judgments according to each particular case, and that is why we are free. We enjoy greater liberty and are more independent. Our power of judgment knows no obstacles. We do not have to obey any prescriptions or orders. I would almost say that we are under no obligation to defend any cause whatsoever." On the commonalities and differences within academic skepticism, Hadot informs us that the earliest academic skepticism, followed shortly after by Cicero and even philosophers like Plutarch and Favorinus. What is common is that the distinction between discourse about philosophy and philosophy itself is very clear. Philosophy was, above all, an art of living. But two views on this subject were current in the academy. Either, as Arcelius thought, theoretical philosophical discourses are incapable of grounding or justifying this art of living, and only critical discourse can introduce us to it. Or else, as Carneades and Cicero held, theoretical and dogmatic philosophical discourses are only fragmentary, ephemeral means used on a case-by-case basis, depending on their greater or lesser effectiveness in the concrete practice of philosophical life. In any case, the commonalities of all major forms of skepticism, both within the academy and across academic empiricist skepticism, is a strong distinction between philosophy and philosophical discourse. Skeptical discourse leads to its own suppression. It is in the movement from academic to Pyrrhonian skepticism that, according to A.J. Volk, skeptical discourse leads to its own suppression and abandons the field in favor of a way of life. At bottom, however, the project of both skepticisms were the same. The skeptics, out of a love for human beings, proposed a new diagnostic of the causes of human unhappiness and a remedy and curative therapy for this suffering. One of the most beautiful and helpful passages in all the writings of the skeptics, and which also sums up the basic ethos of all its schools, is in Sextus Empiricus. "He who thinks that a thing is beautiful or ugly will never stop worrying. When he finds he lacks anything he considers good, he imagines he is enduring the worst torments, and he hurls himself into the search for what he thinks is good. No sooner does he come to possess it, however, than he is plunged into myriad worries brought about by his being excited excessively and beyond reason. Fearing that his luck will not last, he does everything possible so that what he thinks good will not be taken away from him. By contrast, he who utters no opinion on what is naturally good or on what is naturally bad flees nothing and does not exhaust himself in vain pursuits, and he is free of troubles." And in the most famous of all skeptic teaching stories, thus what happens to the skeptic is the same as what they say happened to the painter Apelles. One day he was painting a horse and wanted to represent the foam from the horse's mouth on his canvas. He gave up in a fury and hurled at the canvas the sponge with which he wiped his brushes. This left a trace of color which imitated the horse's foam. Similarly, the skeptics hoped to obtain freedom from trouble by using their judgment to resolve the contradiction between what appears to us and what is conceived of, and when they did not achieve this, they suspended their judgment. Happily, freedom from trouble accompanied the suspension of their judgment, as shadows accompany bodies. And Hadot glosses, just as Apelles was able to achieve perfection in art by renouncing art, so the skeptic was able to realize the philosophical work of art, that is, peace of mind, by renouncing philosophy in the sense of philosophical discourse. Hadot also goes into some helpful detail on all 10 or now 11 arguments in favor of skeptical epoché, dividing them into 6 sensible and 5 theoretical ones. And on the epoché in general, he reminds us, as does Diogenes Laertius, that it is always intended as a purgative which evacuates itself along with the humors whose evacuation it provokes. A.J. Volk rightly compares this attitude to that of Wittgenstein, who, at the end of the Tractatus, rejects the propositions of the Tractatus like a ladder which has become useless. Likewise, Wittgenstein opposed philosophy as pathology to philosophy as a cure. Hadot asks, what is left of philosophical discourse after this elimination of discourse by discourse? Only a way of life, life itself, everyday life as everyone leads it. This is to be the skeptic's rule, simply to utilize his natural resources, his senses and intelligence, just as lay people do. We are to conform to the customs, laws, and institutions of our country and follow our natural tendencies and dispositions. Was this a naive return to simplicity and even a self-deception? Hegel certainly thought so, and Hadot says, perhaps. At the very least, we have to acknowledge, however, that the philosopher in question here was anything but naive. And like the Epicureans and Stoics, the skeptics used short, striking sayings to renew their choice of life at every moment, such as, "This is no better than that," "Perhaps," "All is indeterminate," "Everything escapes comprehension," "Every argument is opposed by an equal argument," and "I suspend judgment." In the life of Pyrrho, we hear that the skeptics are those who enunciate the doctrines of others to prove their own perfect indifference, just as if they were to express the same thing by a simple sign. Dogmatic philosophers all too often act like simpletons. The conclusions they draw from their hypothetical principles are not scientific truths, but mere suppositions, and that by the same means and method one might establish the most improbable things. Also unmentioned so far, the skeptics also denied the very idea of causality. For there are not two features here, cause and effect, but rather a continuous sequence of events, accessible only as appearance. This particular passage in the life of Pyrrho will of course have been read by David Hume in his irrefutable skepticism concerning the necessary connection of cause and effect. And lastly, some authors have asserted the chief good of the skeptic is impassibility, and others that it is mildness or tranquility. Having introduced the core doctrines of the three major philosophical schools of Hellenistic and Roman antiquity, omitting now for Neoplatonism, it remains to try to more fully understand each one of these schools in terms of their divergent contributions to philosophical religion, philosophy of religion, or philosophical theology. By far the best and most illuminating text on this is Cicero's De Natura Deorum, written around 45 BCE. This is an amazing text when you think about it, a whole dialogue written in high oratorical and argumentative style and devoted to lively debate about the merits and demerits of the view on the gods in the three major schools of ancient philosophy. However, the difficulty of this text is also enormous and we can't cover the whole thing here. What I'll do for the rest of this video is just give us a little roadmap and some highlights. Cicero's dates are 106 BCE to 43 BCE. He was a Roman statesman, orator, popularizer, and transmitter of Greek philosophy to the Romans, as well as an accomplished political theorist and an augur or diviner, as well as an academic skeptic, but sympathetic to Stoicism. To our mind, a bundle of paradoxes. But in Cicero's time, really not very surprising. His academic skepticism was deployed precisely as a means of suspending any ultimate knowledge or worldview and seen as consistent with his practices of traditional religion as handed down by the ancestors. As a young man, and then again after his political career, Cicero knew personally many of the most prominent philosophers of his day. And since most of the philosophical writings of this period have been lost, Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, although intended for a general audience, became a key source for the knowledge of philosophy. Most importantly, his exhortation to philosophy, or Hortensius, has been lost, but it exerted a profound influence on St. Augustine's search for the divine in philosophy. Cicero also wrote books devoted to epistemology, divination, ethics, and fate, and his most extensive work that has survived is on academic skepticism. His own position on religion is complicated. He is against Epicurean theology, for Stoic theology, but also an academic skeptic in method, and relies on Aristotle for many of his central doctrines. A little bit on Roman religion in Cicero's time. The Roman gods, although related to the Greek and adopting of Greek religion, is less mythical, can be more impersonal and remote. The Roman gods keep a watchful eye on the activities of the Roman state and protect the family shrines, or lairs. Performing traditional ritual and offerings correctly is the prescribed norm to avoid divine displeasure and to procure the blessings of the gods. Above all, the Roman virtues of justice, good faith, deference to authority, discipline, prudence, courage, chastity, modesty must be upheld against decadence and the slide into vice. The Romans saw themselves as a chosen people, guided to world domination on account of their orderly civic virtues. Priests were very much a part of this virtuous way of life and part of government, and at times sought to reconcile official religion with Stoic philosophy in particular, somewhat accounting for the paradox of how Cicero can be a practicing augur, while at the same time an academic skeptic. We read his famous statement on the relation of true religion to superstition. We must perpetuate religious belief, which is closely associated with the knowledge of nature, but we must likewise eradicate superstition, root and branch. Superstition breathes down your neck, following you at every turn. You may be listening to a seer or an omen. You may be offering a sacrifice or observing a bird's flight. You may be confronting an astrologer or a soothsayer. It may be lightning or thunder or a bolt in the heavens. It may be the birth or creation of some prodigy. Something of this sort must necessarily occur almost every day, so that our minds can never be at rest. The movement towards true religion is assisted by skepticism for Cicero, for skepticism frees us from an overly naive or fearful investment in unexpected events about which we might be superstitious. The three main characters in Cicero's dialogue are Velleius, a representative of Epicurean theology, and he presents the first long speech and is refuted by Cotta in Book 1. Balbus, a representative of Stoic theology, he presents the second long speech in Book 2. And finally Cotta, who is a representative of academic skepticism, and he raises more favorable objections against Balbus's Stoic theology in Book 3. On Cicero's own views, we can only really say he seems ill-disposed to Epicurean theology, and so the fewest pages are devoted to it, and that although he pokes some holes in the position of Stoic theology, his intention seems to be mostly to shore it up. In composing this work, it is thought that Cicero used several books by famous philosophers, of which have been lost. So, On the Nature of the Gods has become one of our only ways to reconstruct the views of several ancient philosophers in all three schools, such as especially the Stoic Chrysippus and Posidonius. Recall what we learned about Epicurus and Epicureanism last week, especially the notion that our senses are our only source of knowledge and infallible. It is human beings who interpret the evidence of sense impressions falsely. The objects themselves give off a film of atoms or images, eidola, which are impressed upon and interpreted by the sense organs. Here we learn that dreams and other subtle impressions are similarly a result of sense impression, films of subtle atoms, but from objects further away. And this explains why dreams can very often be clairvoyant or granted by the gods. In Epicurean theology, gods are like human beings, but writ large in nature. They too are formed of atoms, but have quasi-bodies and quasi-blood, i.e. they are refined spiritual beings, but still very physical and material. These statements in the Epicurean school about God's quasi-bodies and God's quasi-bloods are going to be the subject of much ridicule here. The first big hole to be poked is that since the number of atoms are infinite, there are also potentially an infinite number of gods. In answer to what do the deities do, the gods live a happy life of self-absorption and tranquility remote from the world. They delight in wisdom and virtue, but take no part in creation. Nevertheless, they enjoy god food and god drink and rest and festivities and friendships. We owe them reverence and worship as wondrous models of wise behavior to aspire to. And when we achieve this, we also, at least to some degree, enter the quote intermundia, that is interworld or subtle in-between space, where the subtle matters of which our souls are composed interact through visionary contact or dream with the divine world, and even more subtle in-between space in which the gods have their quasi-bodies, quasi-being, and quasi-blood. The intermundia is the in-between where the images, eidola of the gods are more clearly visible through the senses. In Book 1 of On the Nature of the Gods, Velleius presents many of these positions, and we'll look at a couple of his statements soon. The second major theology of Cicero's time is, of course, the Stoic. By 100 BCE, Posidonius was the leading Stoic. Cicero knew him well, and it's thought he used lost treatises by him to create his four-part exposition of Stoic doctrine in Book 2. Stoics agreed that all knowledge came through the senses, but not that the senses are infallible. Rather, the process of perception or forming mental images, phantasiae, involves an interpretive process between sense data and the sense organs and can lead to error. Stoic theology does not rely on the subtle film of the bodies of the gods in the intermundia, but is indebted to Heraclitus's fire doctrine, which they combine with Anaximenes' air doctrine. Accordingly, they spoke of fiery breath, pneuma, as the prime element which animates all matter in a dynamic continuum. Called the fiery breath providence, reason, destiny, necessity, and posited that it undergoes a continual process of creation and destruction. They believed pneuma controls the universe according to fate, hymermene or fatum, and that causality is deterministic, not unpredictable and chance-related as the Epicureans believed. We'll be looking here only at Balbus's main argument for Stoic providence in just a moment. Within the history of academic skepticism, Cicero in fact attends the Platonic Academy, which has since become skeptic, well after the period of Arcelius, as well as Carneades and Clitomachus. In fact, it's under Philo of Larissa that Cicero learns skepticism. Of course, the academic skeptics have no theology per se. Some skeptics do indeed suspend judgment concerning the very existence of the gods. But in Cicero's time, the gods, like the good nature of the human being, still form something of a dogmatic core of the heart, simply one that has no need of being stated in theoretical reason. The purpose of academic skepticism, and Cicero's application of it, to clear our minds of the phantoms of false beliefs about the gods, and so that we can more authentically engage with the appearances of the gods and acts of divine piety. You can see from this most broad outline how Christian apologists might have used extensively this text to direct withering attacks on pagan religion and buttress arguments for Christian monotheism. However, by the Enlightenment, skeptical thinkers used it to demonstrate the philosophical uncertainty underlying all orthodox beliefs. It was extremely widely read. Augustine cites and criticizes it 15 times in the City of God to demonstrate God's foreknowledge of events and to rail against Roman superstition. Writers in late antiquity to the early Middle Ages used it for educational purposes. And most famously and importantly, it became the literary basis for Scottish thinker David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, which follow its structures closely, strengthen its skeptical arguments, but within a modern, positive skeptical position. It was Voltaire who gave the book its greatest praise, calling it, quote, the best little book of all antiquity. After Voltaire, however, its reputation suffered, due, as the editor points out, to blood and iron historians like Mommsen, and the fact that historians cared to read it only in order to reconstruct lost ancient philosophy. Finally, to the cult of originality. Cicero is here self-admittedly a copyist. The first paragraph of Book 1 is pretty marvelous. It begins, there are many issues in philosophy which to this day have by no means been adequately resolved. Above all, the nature of the gods, which is the noblest of studies for the human mind to grasp. Most philosophers have stated that gods exist, but there have been significant doubters. Views on what they are, where they are, their manner of life are not in harmony. Are the gods inactive and idle, transcendent or immanent, creative or controlling, interested or disinterested in human affairs? Answers to this vary, and as good academic skeptics, we don't know, nor do we know fully the right way to show devotion to the gods. Is all our worship mere superstition? This lack of knowledge concerning the gods is deeply disturbing, since in Cicero's time at least, if reverence for the gods is removed, trust in the social bond between men and the uniquely preeminent virtue of justice will disappear. There are many compelling accounts of the roles of the gods in this world. Sometimes the gods are counselors, helpers, producers, bestowers, blessers, but also many compelling skeptical arguments. Since belief about the gods ranges so widely, there are really only two possibilities. One, it may be that no view is correct, and two, it may be that one view is more correct than others. Cicero goes on to praise philosophy as an honorable refuge and explains the consolations it provides to those afflicted by the terrible blows of fortune. He also says that those seeking for a clear Ciceronian position are being too inquisitive. The point is to ask the philosophical questions oneself. This introduction casts some skeptical shadow. Final statement on the work as a whole, where Cicero suggests that the Stoic view is more closely connected to the truth. Against the appeal to authority, he writes, I myself tend to disapprove of the alleged practice of the Pythagoreans. The story goes that if they were maintaining some position in argument and were asked why, they would reply, because the master said so, the master being Pythagoras. In cases like this, prior judgment exercised such sway that authority prevailed even when unsupported by reason. Cicero is going to use this same attack against the appeal to authority in critiquing the Epicurean theology. He explains how he intends to use the skeptical method as a sifter without being a committed skeptic in the domain of religion. Mastering and evaluating any individual philosophical system is, of course, a daunting task. How much more difficult to master all of them, as we've attempted in this course. Yet this is what we must do if we are at all times to avoid the appeal to authority. On this exhortation to philosophy as a whole, Cicero remains quite modest. I do not claim to have developed practiced ease in this great and difficult enterprise, but I can boast that I have made the attempt. To people who say he is unoriginal and merely a popularizer, he replies, certain people are slow learners, that they need clearly to be instructed more than once. Also defending himself at the get-go from the charge of relativism that nothing is true, replies that the outcome of such an inquiry is our view that many things are probable, and that though these are not demonstrably true, they guide the life of the wise man because they are so significant and clear-cut. He then articulates his intention to bring all the philosophical views together to be subjected to critical evaluation, and gives a motivational motto or exhortation to philosophy, adapting from the Roman play The Youthful Comrades. Ye gods, and all ye citizens and youths, I pray, I beg, demand, implore, beseech your aid today. And here Cicero has one big request for us. It is not that we would pay him praise for the work he's done for us, for this remains a trifling matter, but instead that we should all attend, investigate, and pass judgment on the views we are to hold on religion, divine observances, holiness, religious ceremonial, on good faith and oath-taking, on temples and shrines and solemn sacrifices, as well as on the very auspices over which he himself presides, that is, the arts of the diviner or augur. For each and every one of these things relates to the issue of the immortal gods. And certainly the widespread disagreement on this important matter among highly learned men must occasion doubts in the minds of those who believe they have attained a measure of certainty concerning it. Well, that's a tall order, Cicero. Are we up for it? After this preface and at the beginning of the actual dialogue, Cotta the skeptic, Velleius the Epicurean, and Balbus the Stoic are all hanging out in Cotta's house during a festival talking philosophy, a bit like the initial setup of Plato's Republic. They first lament the absence of Piso, who would have represented the Aristotelian or Peripatetic school. They discuss the politics of the various schools and seem most interested in certain recent development in Stoicism's dialogue with the Peripatetics. The way Velleius' speech outlining the Epicurean theology is introduced already suggests ridicule, quote, "Then Velleius, with breezy confidence customary with Epicureans, and fearing nothing so much as to give the impression of doubt about anything, spoke as if he had just come down from attending the gods' assembly up in the Epicurean intermundia." Due to his commitment to chance, Greek tuche, Latin fortuna, Velleius first takes aim at the Stoic doctrine of providence or providentia, the idea that the gods take care of the world. He next recounts the history of learned opinions about the gods to be found in the Pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, among others, before turning to the beginnings of the Stoic school. Next, he states, pretty arrogantly, that all the views he has covered are not considered judgments by philosophers, but dreams of madmen. Indeed, the utterances of poets are not much more ridiculous, though the very charm they exercise is harmful with their portrayal of the gods. Persian magi and Egyptians as well provide not much more than fanciful herd doctrines. Next, he expounds Epicurus' concept of prolepsis. This is the doctrine that we have innate knowledge concerning the existence of the gods, since their images are imprinted in the mind by nature. Notice how much this doctrine sounds like Jung's psychological archetypes. Next, Velleius gets into all the more specific details of Epicurus' theory, outlined briefly above, especially his doctrines of infinity, and also isonomia, or equal balance, and distribution of all things, a concept which here is stretched to include not only this physical but also the spiritual world. Next, he argues in favor of an idol god, or in Latin Dios otiosus, rather than the workaday god of Stoicism, who is busy meddling with his will in the world. Finally, Velleius refutes the Stoic doctrine of hymarmene. This is the idea that every chance event is the outcome of an eternal chain of causation leading back to a necessary divine cause. Hymarmene is also how the Stoics understood the orderly procession of the cosmos, and thus the basic art of astrology. Once Velleius is done speaking, Cotta gets up to refute. Since our time here is limited, we're going to leave Velleius' speech and focus more on the more compelling and accessible passages in Balbus' speech, and this requires us to skip over most of Book 1, which is Cotta's refutation of Velleius. This part can be a bit tedious, but is also hilarious. For example, Cotta spends 30 pages totally savaging and ridiculing the idea of gods as atomic compounds, and thus the anthropomorphism in Epicurus' view. Cotta's spirited rebuttal, such as when he writes, "As for this Epicurean account of yours, it is utter eyewash, hardly worthy of the old women who spin yarn by candlelight." Cotta's main target is to refute the ex consensus gentium argument. In other words, just because there is near universal consensus on something, such as the gods existing like humans, and thus anthropomorphically, this does not mean it's true. And he also points out effectively the topics that are barely addressed in the Epicurean account, such as where are the gods? Is the intermundia really a good solution? And why are they immortal, given that they are atomic bodies like ours, just more subtle and have quasi-blood? Velleius takes this berating of his Epicurean theology with equanimity and dignity and does not offer a rebuttal. The conversation moves on to the presentation of Stoic theology by Balbus. It is broken down into 4 parts. 1. The proof that gods exist. 2. The nature of the gods. 3. That they order the universe. And 4. That they have the interests of the human race at heart. Aww. This leads us to the end of page 3 in the original pagination of book 2. What follows is the breakdown of these 4 claims of Stoic theology, which is very valuable and orderly, but difficult of access and too long for us here. You can view a summary of all these claims in the summary of the text I've attached this week at the beginning. Because it is the most beautiful and well-written part of the dialogue, I've only included in the course pack breakdowns of the third argument about divine providence and Stoic cosmotheology. This is less of an argument than a gorgeous oration that I think most people will find inspiring. And it's also the place where we find a citation from Aristotle's lost treatise on philosophy of his own version of the cave myth, which ends up playing a decisive role in the argument here. You may recall that this text by Aristotle on philosophy raised questions about whether Aristotle might have at some point in his philosophical career believed in Plato's demiurge, but also in the providential arrangement of nature from the will of the divine, as opposed to the more contemplative deity, active only from the point of view of mirroring intellect in the metaphysics. Cicero's purpose, he draws from Aristotle's On Philosophy a vivid image of the Stoic philosopher leaving the cave, being exposed to the world's wonders, noting this is as far as Aristotle takes it, but let us further envisage a darkness as dense as that which, when the volcano erupted at Etna, it's said to have blotted out the neighboring districts. For 2 days no one could recognize his neighbor, and when on the 3rd day the sun broke through, people felt they had come to life again. Now supposing after an eternity of darkness, we suddenly and similarly beheld the light of day, how would the heavens then appear to us? But as things stand, because we routinely see them every day, our mind grows inured, so that we do not experience wonder or seek to explain what lies before our eyes. It is as if novelty, rather than the majesty of creation, is what must rouse us to investigate the causes of the universe. Who would regard a human being as worthy of the name if, upon observing the fixed movements of the heaven, the prescribed dispositions of the stars, he denied the existence of rationality in all these, and claimed that chance was responsible for works created with a degree of wisdom such as our wisdom fails totally to comprehend? And it's here that Cicero gives the earliest example of the found clock analogy, from which is derived for the whole later history of philosophy the argument from design. In simplest form, if you find a watch on a beach, you must assume, noticing its mechanical design, an intelligent cause. Thus the Stoic, leaving the cave, finds the universe one immense found clock, which must be the cause of intelligent design by an intelligent deity. Thoroughly exploring the various versions and objections to the argument from design, he concludes, let us abandon the refinement of argument and concentrate our gaze, so to say, on the beauty of things which we declare have been established by divine providence. These lines of persuasive, impassioned thinking are of course not likely to move the skeptic, but it's nonetheless fascinating to see how the terms of the argument about the operation of divine providence in the world and the understanding of nature as a teleological system displaying clear evidence of intelligent design have changed very little from Cicero's day to our own. Of course, the Richard Dawkins of the world could point to entropy and systems theory here to explain away the apparent signs of design and providence in the world, and so stick to a more robust form of Pyrrhonian skepticism or contemporary atheism. That doesn't change that passages like these from Cicero from the 1st century BCE are as fascinating to read today as they were 2,000 years ago. There's lots more to say on all the specific ins and outs of books 1 and 2, the various arguments for Stoic theology. We haven't covered here Cauda's skeptical refutation, or rather refining of the Stoic position in book 3, but I'm sure having heard this lecture on skepticism, you can see how those would go. I've included a selection of them in the course pack for this week, so let this suffice as a general introduction and somewhat of a hook, in the hopes you'll read Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. Thanks for listening to this lecture on Cynicism, Skepticism, and the Hellenistic philosophy of religion, and I'll see you next week when we turn to Neoplatonism.